And throughout the pandemic, we brought our members and non-members alike timely and important information on ways to address the challenges that you all have faced that were brought on by COVID-19. We've relied on trusted experts and partners such as Stanton Law to provide accurate information so that you can continue to operate your businesses safely, efficiently, and profitably. And most importantly, to be in compliance with federal, state, and local rules that have been made throughout this past year and a half. Our goal has been, and it continues to be, to provide you with unbiased information so that you can make the decisions that you need that are appropriate for your individual businesses. So with that, I want to thank Josh, Joel, and Stanton Law for everything that you have done in the last year and a half to help our businesses, and introduce you to Josh, where he's going to talk about the COVID saga continues.
So first of all, good morning, and thank you everybody for being here, and thank you for having me join you this morning, and the Urban Agricultural Council and Mary Kay for speaking about what's a pretty important issue on a lot of people's minds in every industry right now. So my name is Josh Joel, and I'm an employment lawyer at Stanton Law. We actually represent a good number of landscape design and other companies in this industry, and we've been seeing a lot of issues come up recently with respect to the Delta variant, and everyone thought this was going to be over, but it's not. And unfortunately, we are kind of back at a place where we've had to backtrack and go back and consider how we can bring people back to work safely and deal with the various levels, as Mary Kay said, of compliance with federal and state law with respect to COVID issues. And so I'm here this morning to basically give you the basics of what you need to know to avoid legal pitfalls. A little bit about me. Again, I'm an employment lawyer at Stanton Law. I live in DeKalb County. I've got 5 kids over there. I love my garden. But again, my goal this morning is really to provide guidance and direction to mitigate the risks of legal issues in the workplace and liabilities with respect to COVID. Now, again, I want to make one caveat, as Mary Kay said, that we're here not to talk about the politics of this. We're not going to talk about the medical issues, the social issues, the cultural issues with respect to COVID and the vaccines and all these different things. But rather, we're going to talk about the legal and business implications that you need to know about, regardless of your political or social views around these issues. So a couple of things I wanted to talk about this morning that are on top of people's minds, and I'm sure you're hearing it a lot in the news today, especially the last couple of weeks. The first is the vaccine policies, and different companies are taking different approaches to vaccine policies and how to handle them. And we're going to talk a little bit about what those are and the legal risks of the various approaches to that. And then so workplace safety issues in the workplace, how to keep a safe work environment. We're going to touch very briefly on COVID leave, and then a couple other considerations that you might think about as you are approaching your COVID compliance issues. Okay, so when we're talking about vaccination policies, the biggest issue that most you're hearing about, especially you hear about Delta and UPS and all these folks kind of putting in either voluntary or mandatory vaccination policies. And so there are kind of 3 options when you're dealing with a vaccination policy. Again, this is not a political issue. It's a business issue and a legal issue. And so when you're thinking about vaccinations and keeping a safe workplace, there are 3 options. Obviously, do you mandate the vaccine, which some companies are doing? Do you create some sort of voluntary vaccination program, or do you do something in between? An example of that would be, you either must get the vaccine or you need to start testing yourself once a week. But we have to recognize that when you're considering mandatory, voluntary, or other policies like this, when it comes to vaccinations, the primary issue here is as an employment lawyer for me, is to help my clients and help people work through the legal implications of that. Ultimately, this is a business decision as to what you want to do based upon the folks that you're serving, the kind of employees that you're working with, the PR, what environment are you in, the geography of where you are, what the local attitudes towards the vaccination mandates are. These are all kind of political, public relations, employee relations type issues. But at the end of the day, whichever choice you go forward with, there are legal risks and obligations that you have to know about. And the surprising thing to me as an employment lawyer is knowing that a lot of these very large companies are instituting mandatory vaccination policies. And the reason why that surprises me is not because I disagree necessarily with what they're doing or agree with what they're doing, but from an HR human resources standpoint, it actually creates quite an implementation nightmare. So they obviously have weighed the fact that it's worth it for them to have the mandatory vaccination policies balanced against that implementation nightmare. So for example, which we're going to talk about in a moment, folks don't want to get the vaccine. Well, if there's labor shortages and it's difficult to find workers, especially in today's environment, where it is difficult to find workers, having a mandatory vaccination policy can really cause some issues in getting people to come to work, because it's a free country. If you don't want to get vaccinated, you can choose to work somewhere else. In addition, just the enforcement issues with respect to that, you have to recognize that if you're going to mandate the vaccine, that means that if someone does not get vaccinated, you are going to have to terminate them or discipline them in that way because it's a mandate. And of course, from an HR standpoint, it becomes a very difficult thing to mandate, because you're going to have to consider what we're going to talk about in a moment, which is reasonable accommodations, people who come to you and say they have a religious or a disability need not to get the vaccine. And of course, putting in place a timeline to allow for people to get the vaccine in an appropriate way. So it is quite a difficult thing to do, to mandate a vaccine. And generally, we're not seeing a lot of employers doing that. They're rather moving into something in between, or a voluntary policy, which we'll talk about in a moment. Mandatory vaccination policies. So just to get a sense of what they are, and I don't want to get too caught in the weeds of all of this. And as I mentioned before, recognizing that a mandatory vaccination policy, it's going to require you to go and terminate people potentially for not getting the vaccine. And that's not going to be a very popular thing for a lot of folks. But more importantly, for most companies that have 15 or more employees, you're going to have to recognize that you'll have to put in place religious and disability accommodations for people who come to you and say, I can't take the vaccine because of a disability or because of my religion. Now, what is a disability? This is going to be handled just like any other religious or disability accommodation. I will note that people have allergies, pregnancies, philosophical reasons why they might not want to get the vaccine. And some of these things may or may not be covered by federal law. And we're going to touch upon what to do in those situations as well. But let's talk first a little bit about a disability accommodation. A person comes to you and says, you've mandated a vaccine, and a person comes and says, well, I can't get the vaccine because I've got X medical condition, I'm immunocompromised, something which is assuming a real disability, which is defined as something which impedes a major life function. So let's say someone's immunocompromised would be the best example, and they say, I can't get the vaccine. So what are you going to do? So just like any other situation, if you mandate a vaccine, you're going to have to walk them through an interactive process to help them find a reasonable accommodation that can allow them to do their job. Some examples of what you might allow a person to do if they have a disability and they can't get the vaccine would be face masks, social distancing, regular testing, staggering shifts or working alone. I had one lawn care company come to me and ask me whether they can have someone work alone on their truck every day, basically, because they did not want them to be involved with other employees if they're a higher risk of COVID. That might be a reasonable accommodation. When you're dealing with your office workers as opposed to the people in the field, allowing people to work from home could be a reasonable accommodation, or obviously reassigning them to a different position, which is usually not possible. Now, you have to recognize that you're not required to give a reasonable accommodation or any sort of accommodation if it's going to affect their ability to basically do the functions of the job in a major way. So, if it's going to disrupt the workplace in some way, for example, you have a team out in the field and one guy has a reasonable accommodation to work from home, it ain't going to work, right? You can't have a guy have accommodation to work from home if he's got to be out there in the field or he has to be in the office. And so you have to work with each individual employee who comes to you with a disability accommodation request and walk through what we call the interactive process to ask them, well, what's your disability? How are we going to handle it? And is there a way for us to accommodate you with that disability and not get vaccinated while not causing a potential harm to other people in the workplace? Now, again, this is only if you mandate the vaccine that you're going to have to go through this, because like I said, the alternative to a person not getting vaccinated is going to be discipline and termination. And you don't want to be accused of terminating someone because they have a disability and therefore cannot get the vaccine. They should come to you with a written exemption request. They should ask for it to you in writing, and then you walk through that process of deciding whether it's too burdensome on you in order to allow them to have some accommodation. For example, if they have to work on the team, if they have to be with other people, if there's no other place for them to work, and also potentially another thing to think about is other workplace safety considerations, which we'll talk about in a moment. Another important thing to note is that you're also going to have to put processes in place if people come to you with religious accommodations requests. Now, we have to clarify that we're talking about real, sincerely held religious beliefs against vaccination. We're not talking about just simply political or philosophical views where they say, well, I don't want to take the vaccine because I don't like it, right? That's not going to qualify. So generally, I wouldn't quibble or fight with your employees who come and tell you that they have a sincerely held religious belief not to take the vaccine. That's not a winning argument. But if they do come to you and say, I have a religious reason as opposed to a philosophical reason, we'd recommend you engage in the same basic process we just said and walk through whether there's a way that you can accommodate them without getting vaccinated. Other things to consider when folks are coming to you if you mandate the vaccine is stuff like allergies, as I mentioned earlier. Not necessarily an ADA disability full out, but still we would recommend in that situation you treat it the same way, as well as pregnancy and breastfeeding. Those are also protected under federal law. A little unclear as to whether or not you can force someone who's pregnant or breastfeeding to get the vaccine because the science is a little unclear around there. And so in those situations, I certainly would recommend consulting with an attorney or treating it like some other sort of disability. And of course, when you're going through all of this, make sure to document everything that you're doing in a very, very detailed way. Another thing just to mention as we're talking about this, I know that a lot of folks in your industry often confront a lot of wage and hour issues and overtime issues and other things like that. There's another part of the wage and hour equation which comes into play when you start mandating people to do things as a condition of employment. So if you go and tell them that you have to go get the vaccine in order to come to work, you've actually now made a condition of employment to get the vaccine. And a lot of folks don't know that under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the same federal law which governs wage and hour issues generally in the workplace, if you force someone, a non-exempt employee, to go get the vaccine, that's going to become compensable time. And this is another part of the implementation nightmare of mandatory vaccination policies that you're going to have to pay, or it's highly recommended that you pay your employees for the time that they take to go get the vaccine, especially if that's during work hours. And if it's outside of work hours, it's unclear under federal law whether you have to actually pay them. And we are recommending our people who are doing mandatory vaccination policies to pay people a reasonable amount for the time that they go get the vaccine. So they can go stand in line for 3 hours to get the vaccine, which is not really happening anymore. And you're gonna have to document that and potentially pay them for that time. And so, that's just another layer of issue that's going to come up with respect to a mandatory vaccination policy, which is why generally I'm seeing that they are not the best idea unless there's a very, very strong reason to do so. So now that I've kind of scared you off the mandatory vaccination policies, there's something else to consider over here, which is a voluntary vaccination policy, which is why would you do that? Why don't just leave it willy-nilly, whatever you want to do. We're not going to ask, don't tell. We're not going to talk about vaccinations in the workplace. Now, that could be okay. From a business standpoint, you might want to do that, but probably much better to have a policy in place, which we'll discuss in a moment why. Now, there's two ways that you can create a voluntary vaccination policy. And one is just to make it kind of a neutral policy and say, if you get vaccinated or don't get vaccinated, we're not going to get involved in that decision at all. But the important part of the policy, which we'll discuss momentarily, which applies both with any kind of vaccination policy you put in place, is going to be the workplace safety issues that come up if you have a voluntary policy. Meaning if you're not going to ask them or you're not going to know whether or not they are vaccinated or not, then you are potentially facing more risks, and it becomes more important to put in place a workplace safety program to make sure that folks are going to be safe in the workplace, and you're going to be covered with respect to your legal risks in that respect. the middle ground here, which we're seeing a lot of employers do, is to put in place what we're calling a vaccination encouragement program or an incentive program. And so what a lot of folks are doing is they do, for a variety of reasons, for their workplace safety, they don't want to require their employees to go get the vaccine, but they want them to be incentivized to do so. For example, if you have people working in office and you want to maintain a safe work environment in your office, and everybody's coming into the office, you require them to come back by X date into the central office, you know, your HR people and your billing people and all those folks. Well, you want to make sure that they're safe when they come back to the office. So how do you do that? One way to do that is to incentivize the vaccine and to make it to create an incentive program. Some examples of what you can do is you can say to them, if you show the proof of vaccination, which we'll talk about in a minute, how to do that. If you show a proof of vaccination, we will give you a certain bonus. We'll grant you a certain amount of PTO, a gift card. I've got one client who put a raffle in place that anybody who shows their vaccination status of vaccination will be entered into a raffle. We'll talk about in a moment why that could be a problem, or swag or something else. The important thing to note when it comes to these kind of things is an incentive can't be too coercive. You can't make an incentive that essentially punishes those who don't get the vaccine, for a variety of issues relating to, again, going back to ensuring an equitable work environment. And then the other piece just to think about, again, going back to the wage and hour issues, is that certain incentives, if you're giving them money, a bonus and these kind of things, that might be considered compensable time under the wage and hour laws. And you might have to take that into consideration when you're considering their overtime and how to pay them in that respect. So it does create some complications to do the incentives. And of course, one question that comes up to us is, well, what about the fact that if someone has a disability and they can't get the vaccine, they're no longer going to be eligible for that PTO grant or for the bonus or for whatever we're providing to them? Isn't that a disability? And the answer is it might be. Isn't that discrimination? And the answer is it very well might be. And therefore, one way around that is, for example, to grant people who have disability accommodations generally or anything like that, grant them the incentive one way or the other so they're not treated differently from those who haven't. And again, as we mentioned earlier, when you put a voluntary policy in place, it's really important to then focus on an appropriate workplace safety program. Another important consideration with the vaccinations, and this goes back to whether or not you are implementing a mandatory or a voluntary or an incentive program with respect to vaccinations. The number one question that we seem to be getting from our clients with respect to vaccinations is, can I ask my employees their vaccination status? Again, what can I ask? How can I ask? And how can I make them prove that they're vaccinated one way or the other? Under a mandatory policy, this makes a big difference because a person's not going to be able to come back to work if they don't have their vaccination taken care of. Under a voluntary policy, it also makes a difference because the level of vaccination in the workplace is going to make a difference to how you're going to treat people with respect to workplace safety. And we'll talk about that momentarily. But there's two ways. So the short answer to the question is yes. You can ask your employees whether they're vaccinated. You can ask them that question, and that's not a problem. What you shouldn't ask them is for more information beyond that. Why are you not vaccinated? Unless they've requested a disability accommodation, better not to ask why. Because that will get into a rabbit hole of issues with respect to accommodations requests, and that's on them. Let them ask for the accommodation. And when it comes to asking people for a record of vaccination, there are two ways to do that. You are permitted to ask your employees to show their vaccination card. That is permitted under federal law, and that's okay. But that does create some complications. It is not considered a medical inquiry, what we call medical inquiry, to ask them about their vaccination status or to ask them to show their card. But if they are going to give you the card to hold on to in order for you to keep a record of who's vaccinated and who's not, you're going to run into serious confidentiality issues where employees' medical information has to be maintained in a confidential way, separate from the rest of their employee file and under certain federal guidelines, you might have to hold on to that information for a very long time. And so generally that does create some complications if you're going to maintain a record of their vaccination card. So another way of doing it is a self-attestation where you create a form where people can verify to you whether or not they are vaccinated. And again, that information is going to be something you are going to have to maintain confidentially, but it's a little less intense than having all these vaccination cards that you're going to have to maintain in a comprehensive way. If you have a third-party PEO or anything like that maintains some of your employee records, some of those are offering ways for folks to maintain this information that's compliant, or they claim is compliant with the federal law, but it's kind of an uncharted territory. But again, you should not ask for any other medical information aside for are you or are you not vaccinated, and certainly not ask for any genetic information to the extent that comes up, because that implicates all sorts of federal laws. But once you know who's vaccinated and who's not, and this is a critical point that we hear a lot of issues about, you have to keep the individual status of each employee's vaccination confidential. You're required under federal law to maintain the confidentiality of your employees' medical records. So therefore, you can't tell anybody else, whether employee X, whether Jim or Leslie or whoever it is vaccinated. You can't tell anybody, including other employees. So you will not. So if someone comes to you and says, is so-and-so vaccinated, or I got to work in the truck with so-and-so, or I got to be in a cubicle with so-and-so, is he vaccinated? You're not permitted to give that information to anybody, including other employees. So the question becomes, well, how do I communicate to my clients, and how do I communicate to the other employees how safe the work environment is, and who's vaccinated and who's not? Because a lot of folks will say, I'm okay with someone coming into the office as long as they're vaccinated. I'm okay interacting with someone without a mask as long as they're vaccinated. Well, how do you know? So a couple of things you can do. One is you can tell people the percentages generally of how many people are vaccinated and how many people are not, in a way that does not identify any individual. So let's say you have 90% vaccination status. You can tell your clients, I'm letting you know that 90% of my employees are vaccinated, or 100% of my employees are vaccinated. You can also say to them, if you mandate the vaccine, that we have a mandatory vaccination policy. So you can communicate what your policy is. You can communicate general percentages as to who has the vaccine and who does not. But I will say that if you have, let's say, I don't know, 2 people out in the field working in a truck, and you say, well, 50% of the people coming to your house are vaccinated, or 50% of the people in the truck are vaccinated, and that makes it pretty clear who is and who isn't. That's not a good idea. That on its own is going to reveal the vaccination status of the individual. And so therefore, that's something you should not do. The other thing to consider when you're talking about the vaccine is harassment and retaliation issues. Just be very certain that, I know there's a lot of very, very strong feelings around there about vaccination status, and people are not treating each other well around these issues, for better or for worse. And it's really important that people are not harassing each other, bullying each other, treating anybody differently with respect to their employment. While vaccination status is not a protected class under federal law, and therefore they can't go say you're harassing them based upon their vaccination status. If they have a disability or they have some other consideration, it could be a big issue, as well as the fact that you don't want to have that kind of environment in the work environment as well. The last piece is vaccine passport laws. Just be aware that Georgia does not yet have any specific laws. Vaccine passport laws are the ones that you're hearing about out of Texas and maybe out of Florida, that are requiring certain people not to make it a condition of being able to enter a place if they don't have the vaccine, or they do have the vaccine. So the vaccine passport laws are not an issue in Georgia yet. Some states are saying you have to have the vaccination to enter into a restaurant or something else like that. Some other states are saying that you cannot disallow anybody from entering a place without the vaccination if they are not vaccinated. Those are not yet an issue in Georgia. It has not come up yet, and it seems like the legislature is avoiding that issue entirely. So moving along to workplace safety issues with respect to COVID-19. As all of you, I'm sure, are well aware, the OSHA is the federal agency which enforces workplace safety, and they have all sorts of guidelines with respect to all sorts of issues, and I'm sure you guys come up with it a lot in your industry because of workplace injuries and other things like that. OSHA also governs other areas, something that a lot of people don't know, of workplace safety, including issues around the safety of the work environment with respect to COVID. And so OSHA has basically said we are going to follow CDC guidelines when it comes to the implementation of workplace safety measures. And as all of you know, it's very frustrating, but the CDC is moving back and forth all the time with respect to what's the right thing. And everyone's kind of shooting in the dark right now as to what's the right thing to do with respect to workplace safety and with respect to safety generally. OSHA just issued, I believe, 2 days ago, new guidelines based upon the recent CDC guidance as to workplace safety issues. Now, do note that OSHA guidance is not necessarily legally binding. It's advisory in nature. It's designed to create a safe work environment. But if you do get caught up in an OSHA violation, as y'all know very well, I'm sure, you can get citations and get into all sorts of issues with that. And where it comes up mostly is if someone contracts COVID-19 or claims to have contracted COVID-19 in the workplace. I will say that adopting a mandatory or voluntary vaccination policy is one of the recommendations of OSHA, and therefore that's going to help you in that respect. In addition to potentially setting up a mandatory testing policy for those who are not vaccinated, which we'll talk about in a moment. As you all know, different cities and municipalities are coming up with different ordinances with respect to masks and other safety policies. I believe right now in the city of Atlanta, it's becoming, the mayor has issued an executive order requiring people in public spaces and private businesses to wear masks or face coverings, regardless of vaccination status. I know that in Fulton County, masks are going to be required inside any public county facilities. And in Athens-Clarke County, masks are required in public or private spaces, in addition to some of the smaller municipalities and other counties around are requiring masks in public places, going back to that requirement. And again, people are all over the board on this. How does that affect your employees and your work environment? Well, for most of you, people who are out in the field, this is not going to be as much of an issue because the CDC guideline is that the latest OSHA and CDC guidance is that the mask ordinances or the mask issues relate to indoor areas where there's a high level of COVID-19 in the environment. So that is Georgia right now. But again, that's referring to indoor public spaces. Where it makes a difference is going to be your back office staff. If you have folks working in the office, whether or not you're gonna have to require those people to wear masks is going to depend on municipal ordinances and the local rules. Most Metro Atlanta counties do not have ordinances in place, and therefore you fall back on the OSHA guidance, which is advisory. It's not absolutely binding on you, but be aware that the latest OSHA guidance is that people should wear masks in indoor areas, and you should require customers who come in to wear masks, as well as putting in place vaccination and testing standards, as we discussed before. And if there's a known exposure, OSHA is saying, and the CDC is saying, if there's a known exposure to COVID, to be tested 3 to 5 days after exposure, which we'll talk about in a moment. So when you want to put in place a workplace safety policy, there's different considerations. There's obviously your employees, how they feel about it, how folks are going to, what the work environment is. So for the people who are out there working in the field, you're not going to have as much of an issue, except when they're perhaps in a car, in a truck, in very close environments. You might want to consider, if you want to take the more restrictive measure, to put in place a masking policy with respect to those environments when they're inside the vehicles, or when you're dealing with your inner office staff. Now, again, it's not required under federal law, but is highly recommended at this point in order to comply with OSHA guidelines. A lot of companies are still not wanting to move forward with masking policies at this point. I think most employers, with the exception of some, are doing a mask optional policy and not requiring masks for fully vaccinated people. And you can do that. You can require only those who are unvaccinated to wear masks, and those who are vaccinated don't have to wear masks. Now, I will say that's not in compliance with the current OSHA guidelines, but it's unclear as to how much this is going to be enforced and what kind of risks there are with respect to OSHA around these issues. There's so many unknowns right now. I did want to touch briefly on COVID testing. whether you're allowed to require COVID testing for folks who are or are not vaccinated. So the answer is yes. One way of, and we do recommend in some situations to create a policy like this for people who, if you don't want to have a mandatory vaccination policy, you can create a policy that says the middle ground would be either get vaccinated or get tested on a regular basis in order to come to work. You are allowed to do that. You are allowed to require people to get tested in order to come to work. And there are implementation issues with that. For example, you will have to pay the same for the vaccinations. You're going to want to pay them for their time that they go to get tested if you're requiring that as a condition to come back to work. And again, this all goes back to maintaining a safe work environment. And for anybody who is actually exposed to COVID and there's a known exposure, you are allowed to and should require testing for them to come back into the office 3 to 5 days after the exposure. So other considerations around workplace safety. Big question we get all the time. The phone rings and someone says, I just had this again from a lawn care company just 3 weeks ago. One of our workers tested positive for COVID. He was exposed to everybody else in the workplace. What do I do? How do I handle the fact that I have an employee who has tested positive for COVID? So the answer is that you're likely going to have to tell the other employees that there was a possible exposure. You should not tell them who it was because that's a confidentiality issue. They might figure it out. And I know this sounds kind of like lawyer, I don't know, dancing on the head of a pin over here, but we recommend that you inform others that there was a possible exposure, but maintain the confidentiality of who it was. Sometimes, obviously, people are going to figure it out on their own pretty easily who it was, but the messaging is going to be important in terms of how you communicate that to folks. And then of course you want to make sure to clean and disinfect the areas and exposure, by the way, according to the CDC, as you probably know, is within six feet for 15 minutes or more. So if people are riding in a truck together, and one of the guys in the truck tests positive for COVID, the others are considered exposed. Now, the ones who are exposed, again, it's going to depend. You follow the CDC guidelines. If they're vaccinated, they're usually going to be able to continue working. You might want to consider requiring them to wear masks until they test negative 3 to 5 days. And the worker who does test positive for COVID should stay home until after the quarantine period that is recommended by the CDC. One interesting question that I got recently was there was a fellow who asked for an accommodation. He tested positive for COVID, and he asked for an accommodation to be able to work alone. He said, I'll go out in my truck and I will go work on my own in the field. And my client asked me, can we allow this guy to go to work if he's just going to be on his own? He's not interacting with customers. He's not interacting with anybody else. He's not interacting with other employees. He's going out and doing lawn care on his own. And I thought about it for a little bit. And the reality is that OSHA doesn't just require you to keep people safe from one another, but it also requires you to keep people safe from themselves. And therefore, in that situation, it gave me a little bit of heartburn because if this person goes out there and overexerts himself in the field because of the COVID, and you're aware of that COVID that he has, and you allowed him to go out, he might come back and say, well, this is a workplace injury that was exacerbated as a result of going back to work. So I counseled them better not to. If he insists or you really need it to happen, maybe there's a way to get him to sign a waiver or a release to be able to come back to work. And that goes back to what I mentioned before. If someone contracts COVID at work or their COVID is exacerbated because they came to work, there could be issues around having to report that to OSHA as a workplace-based illness. Any sort of workplace injury is potentially something you're going to have to report or at least keep track of. And of course, there's the workers' comp issues that come up around that with respect to if someone tests positive, if someone's condition with COVID is exacerbated or is a result of being at work, there might be some workers' comp issues that come up. And I mentioned briefly the waivers, whether or not you can have employees sign waivers around coming back to work. And the answer is yes. I'm not going to get into too much detail about that. But you can potentially ask employees that want to come back to work and not wear masks and these kind of things to sign a waiver of liability that allows them to do what they want to do, even if they are, if it's not in compliance with the CDC rules or anything like that. But if there's any specific questions on waivers, we can discuss that as well. moving on to the COVID immunity laws. I'm just running through the last couple of issues here, and then we'll break for questions. The COVID immunity laws, you probably walk around and see those signs in the doors of a lot of establishments. If you are bringing your employees back to work, or back into an office, or back into a warehouse, or back into any sort of work environment, highly recommended to put those signs up. It is not just a cute thing that people are doing. It's a statutory law, a COVID immunity law, that if you put that sign on your door and it complies with the specific size and fonts and whatever it is that's in that law, you're going to be immune from anybody coming into your office, whether it's a vendor, whether it's a customer, whether it's an employee, or anybody like that. Your business is going to be immune from any claims of someone contracting COVID and wanting to sue you or have any issues with you as a result. So it's such an easy thing to do. You can buy the sign, stick it up on the front entrance of any entrance where people are going to be walking into your building, and you've just alleviated for $5 tremendous amounts of risk and liability. It is not something which is just a cute thing people are doing. It is very much recommended to do that. So that's one thing I just wanted to mention in the context of COVID for those who don't know. And then just moving on to the last couple of points. And again, that, by the way, the COVID immunity applies to dwellings or places of business. So you can't stick a big sign like that on the window of your car. Just the last thing I want to mention is a lot of people are asking us about COVID leave. If an employee goes out on leave because of COVID, what's the deal with that? Because they hear about the laws changed around those issues. It used to be that there was mandatory, you have to give mandatory leave as a result of COVID. Back in January, under the new law that was signed, the federal law, that whole provision of giving COVID leave or the 12 weeks of COVID leave as a result of someone contracting it, that all became voluntary with a tax credit incentive. Now, the issue with that is that, and most people if you didn't opt in to doing it, you don't have to give employees any sort of COVID leave beyond your regular sick leave policies, whether you're covered by the FMLA or not. Beyond your regular sick leave policies, you don't have to unless you've opted into that voluntary law in order to get those tax credits. We are seeing that most people are not opting into that law because the implementation of what you need to do in order to get those tax credits usually outweighs any kind of financial advantage you might get from getting the tax credits. So therefore, generally, it's recommended not to opt in if you can avoid it. Because it just becomes a whole issue in terms of how much leave you have to give. It really brings upon you a lot of requirements under the law to give leave in a certain way, and therefore usually it's not worth it. And so just be aware that there's no federal law that requires you to go and give give that leave beyond your regular sick leave policies and ADA leave policies. But if you do, and you do opt in, which you probably have not or will not, there are tax credits there that are available. The last thing I'll just mention before we move on to some questions, and I know this is a lot of information that I'm spitting out to you guys, and I just trying to give it all out there, and hopefully, the question and answer period will be able to clarify a lot of things. As these are all talking points, obviously, but is remote work. For those of you who have back office staff, if that's relevant to your company or HR and billing and these kind of things, it's important to have policies in place, which I'm sure you have already based upon the last year and a half of people working from home, just making sure that you have policies in place for remote work. If you want to move to a remote work model or a hybrid remote work model or anything like that, creating policies in place to address the safety issues with respect to people who are in the office as opposed to those who are home, the time tracking for people who are working at home, and other issues around making sure that management and your regular employment policies are adjusted if you are planning to move to a permanent situation where you have a good number of people working at home. And recognize that, as we mentioned before, one potential accommodation to someone having a disability which does not allow them to get a vaccine or other things like that is going to be to allow them to work from home. And you want to have policies in place to make sure that you enable those people to work from home. And lastly, as with every other issue in employment law and human resources, everything is about consistency, maintaining consistent policies, having written policies, having your employee handbooks up to date based upon the most recent developments of the law, having your policies in place in a way that is very clear, is up to date, and a consistent implementation of those policies and not treating different people differently. You can treat obviously your office workers versus your in the field workers differently. You can treat different classes of employees in terms of the billing versus sales versus the people who are in operations and people who are out in the field. You can have different policies for different groups of people, but they must be consistently applied. And so those are the major overview issues. I know it's a tremendous amount of information to kind of download at this point. So here's my contact information. I had to drop the picture over there as well of our office because I think it's awesome. But my contact information is over here. You're welcome to take it down if you do want to speak with me directly about any issues that we talked about today. So I did get one question on the chat, and that's from my dear friend Amanda. Thanks for being here. It's nice to see a familiar face. Amanda's a consultant who works with a lot of companies in their operations, and so she asked, as a consultant who travels to other states and onto client sites, which is relevant to a lot of folks over here where you're on site, especially in the commercial context. How do we handle finding out their vaccination status on the site or in the office? That's a very, very good question. They're going to have the same obligations as you have to your employees, not to reveal the individual vaccination status of their employees. But you can ask them, and you probably should ask them if you need to, what their policy is with respect to vaccination, and you can ask them whether they know what percentage of their employees are vaccinated. Again, that's a decision as to what, and they can give you that information. What you can't ask them is, and I would beg you not to ask them because it puts them in a difficult situation, is if you know that you're meeting with Joe Schmo for a certain time, you cannot call them and say, hey, is Joe Schmo vaccinated? You're allowed to call Joe Schmo and ask him, right? That's fine, and he can tell you, or he doesn't have to tell you. But you should not be asking the employer. I had a school that we work with, and they asked whether they can have the parents. If the parent calls them and asks whether the teachers in the school are vaccinated, the answer is no. You can't tell them that, especially if there's only 2 teachers in a classroom. So if you have a client, for example, who says, I'd be happy to have your folks come and work on my site, but they all need to be vaccinated. And they ask you, who are they vaccinated? If you only have 2 people going out there, it's very difficult to be able to answer that question. So I would recommend basically giving them your general policy statement. A similar question we got, which is the flip side of that, which is, can you legally require a vendor to be vaccinated? The answer is yes. Now, can you require them to be vaccinated generally? Well, that's kind of hard to enforce, but you can say that as a condition to be able to come onto the premises of wherever you are, in other words, to come into the office, you have to comply with either be vaccinated or wear a mask, and that is permitted to do. You can, and again, some states, if you're operating in, I think mostly we're in Georgia over here, but the states like Texas, I believe Florida as well, and a couple of others that have kind of a more conservative approach, that might be more problematic because that's going to run afoul of their anti-vaccination passport laws potentially, where they don't allow you to, if you operate a place of public accommodation or a public office, they don't allow you to stop people or ask people from coming in based upon their vaccination status. But in Georgia right now, you could require people coming into the office to be vaccinated or to wear a mask and comply with your workplace safety policies. Again, that's a business decision as to whether that's something that, weighing the risks, you want to do, but you can require that, in my view, at least. Another question we got: if you have fewer than 15 employees and want to have a voluntary vaccine program with an incentive, do you have to allow some way for those with medical or religious objections to get the reward too? This is a very, very, very good question, and the answer to this is that it's unclear. The issue, fewer than 15 employees, 15 obviously is the benchmark as to whether or not you're going to be covered by federal law with respect to disability or religious accommodations. And so that's why the 15 employee benchmark is so important. And the short answer is probably not. Since you have less than 15 employees and you have a voluntary vaccination program, you probably do, and you put the incentives in place. I think the risks are so far out that something might happen as a result of that, unless you have a really, again, big, it's a good question. I think less than 15 employees, you're probably going to be okay because you're not covered by the federal discrimination laws. Where it becomes an issue is more when you have more than 15 employees and someone comes to you and you, let's say, offer an incentive to everyone who is vaccinated, then and someone isn't vaccinated as a result of a disability. And by the way, in the voluntary programs, one of the reasons you might want to require people to ask questions or to tell you their vaccination status and get a sense. One way of doing it is, by the way, is sending out a anonymous survey to all your employees at the beginning when you're considering what kind of vaccination policy to put in place. Sending out an anonymous survey to all your employees and say to them, how many of you, without names, without any information, are you vaccinated? Are you not? Right? Not why not, well, not anything else. And again, whether that's going to be something your employees will react negatively to or not is a whole other story. But that's something you can do to get a sense of what your risks are. It could very well be that you'll find out that 100% of your employees are vaccinated, right? And then this whole thing becomes a moot point. You don't have to get as much involved in the nitty gritty of these details. If you find out that 30% are vaccinated, then you're going to have some more issues around workplace safety and your clients wanting to know that information as well. Another thing to take into consideration on that is also going to be if someone had COVID in the past. The studies are starting to come out now that people who have had COVID in the past and have antibodies are showing a very strong immune response. It hasn't translated yet into the CDC's guidelines and the OSHA guidelines as to people who have had COVID, whether they're going to treat them the same way as people who are vaccinated. But you can ask your employees whether they have antibodies anonymously in that survey. And I would treat that the same way as you would treat the question of the vaccination. Have you had COVID or have you not? And then leave it at that. And that could give you some indication as to your risks in terms of workplace safety and putting a mandatory vaccination policy in place. So that I don't know if that answers the question, but I would say if you're less than 15 employees, I wouldn't be too concerned about the incentives, as long as they're, I would obviously have other concerns to put that, but if you have more than 15 employees, you probably should consider some sort of blanket provision of those incentives, even to those who might have some sort of accommodation request. So another question I received was, what incentives have we seen for employees to get vaccinated? So I touched on that in the beginning. Incentives, bonuses, 2 days PTO. Let me think. The PTO one is a really good one, by the way, because that kind of avoids some of the issues also around having to give people time off if they get vaccinated and get unwell from it. And you can also easily give that PTO to everybody who has been vaccinated, or also to those who have some sort of accommodation. Some sort of $100 gift card we've seen people do, $25 gift card. Again, that might end up being compensable time, might end up being considered part of their wages when it comes to overtime issues. I had one client who did a raffle, and I was going to touch on this a little bit, but I neglected to do that. They created a raffle. Anybody who was vaccinated was entered into a raffle. The problem with that, which is kind of funny, was that they called me, their HR person called me and said, wait a second, we can't publicize who won the raffle. Because if we say that Bob won the raffle, we've just revealed to all our employees that his medical status, his vaccination status. And so the CEO calls me and says, my HR people has gone nuts. My HR person has gone nuts and is telling me I can't publicize who won the raffle. What's the point in a raffle if I can't publicize who won the raffle? Please tell me my HR person is nuts. And I said, no, your HR person is not nuts. Your HR person deserves a raise because she's a darn good HR person, knowing that is a consideration that I might not have even thought of. That if you go reveal who won that raffle, you've now revealed that person is vaccinated and potentially a violation of the ADA and other federal regulations. Another question we received: the Atlanta Falcons recently announced all of their players are vaccinated. What are your thoughts about reporting 100% status, since it basically identifies the vaccine status of all employees? This is I will be honest with you, this is a silly, stupid, whatever you want to call it, distinction, but it is 100% okay to say that 100% of my employees are vaccinated if that doesn't identify any individual employee. It is so almost silly to the point that yes, it does go say that it does, as a result, reveal the vaccination status of every individual, but the way that the federal government guidelines have been coming out is it's going to be okay. You can say 100%. It's ironic that if you say 95%, then it's less likely that you're identifying everybody's individual status. If you say 100%, you've just identified that every single person is vaccinated. But under the federal guidelines right now, that's going to be okay. So those are the questions we have in the chat. I know one person mentioned, I believe it is Frida, mentioned that you have a question that you wanted to to ask, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. Really enjoyed all the information. Just a couple of caveats, because otherwise I think it'll be too ambiguous. I used to structure annuities for personal injury cases, so that's my mindset, background, liability. Okay, so 2 caveats, and I'll try to keep it very succinct, and then the question. So just keep these in mind. Because the medical data is still in flux as to reactions and various things getting the vaccine, so that one is a concern. And then it would be difficult to prove. So those 2 caveats. Here's my question. If an employer required vaccines for their employees and something happened to one or more of the employees from a medical standpoint, and again, I understand it may be difficult to prove, but could that employer be held liable for any potential health issues, disabilities, etc.?
That is a very, very good question, and it's a question that I've heard quite a number of times from people who are thinking of implementing mandatory vaccination policies. I believe, and I'm not, I'd have to get back to you. I'm not entirely certain, but I believe that the federal laws have created some immunities for employers with respect to that. And so I do believe that there are some immunities involved in mandating the vaccine. I also, like you said, I think that proving the proof issue is going to be saying that the vaccine mandate caused you to take the vaccine, which caused you to get sick, which caused you this damage, is going to be a pretty far out risk, and therefore it's not something that a lot of people are being that concerned about. But again, it's just another area where the mandatory vaccination policies do create all sorts of unknowns that we just don't know about yet. And I would imagine, based upon the way that the federal government is handling this with the EEOC and everything else, it's been very much a pro-vaccination stance, both the federal and state level and across the country, that if there are, they will create, if there aren't already, immunities around these issues, because and it's unlikely that you're going to face liability in that respect. But it's a fair question, it's a good question, and another ripple in the discussion as to whether or not you should mandate the vaccine. Cool,
thank you so much.
We did have another question over here. Can a commercial property ask for individual employee vaccine records to come on property? If we're talking about employees, yes, so this would be the same as any other of the things we talked about. Again, that goes into kind of, that's a good question. Maybe we'll have to clarify exactly what we're talking about over here. But again, it goes back to, if it's your employees, you can certainly ask them their vaccination status. I'm just trying to, and does it violate HIPAA if we provide so you cannot provide that information to other people? Maybe I'm unclear on the question.
I think that she's asking if can they ask about her employees?
Oh, okay.
Their employees who are going to work on the property.
The answer is that they can certainly ask anything they want, but I wouldn't give it to them. You cannot provide your individual employee's vaccination status to allow them to anybody, even to come on their property. I see Todd Stanton is raising his hand, which means he probably has some very wise words to say. Todd Stanton is the namesake of Stanton Law. So let's see if he insults me now.
No, I'm not going to take pot shots at you, Josh. Good work. We've gotten this question particularly from construction companies who are building healthcare facilities. So the quick answer is no. Don't provide individual proof of vaccine status. You can assure that customer that everybody who is on site will have been vaccinated if that's their requirement, and that should be good enough for them. If they continue to insist upon proof of that vaccine, let's take a break, step back, and we'll evaluate and have a quick letter writing campaign or a nice call with the CEO, get a higher level involved in that, because it's not appropriate to disclose that personal information on an individual level. So the answer is don't provide it wholesale, don't provide it individually, but you can't provide it wholesale to say, yes, everybody is vaccinated.
Gosh, this is pure speculation, but do you anticipate any changes once the FDA approves the vaccinations?
That's a great question. If you're referring to kind of from a legal standpoint, I think that we're already at a point where, even though it's only provisionally or whatever emergency authorized, we're already at a point where they're saying that you can really require folks to get the vaccine even with just the emergency authorization. So I'm not sure what more could happen in terms of that, in terms of the pro-vaccine point of view. I do know there are a lot of people, I've got friends myself, that will be more willing to get the vaccine once it is emergency approved, and therefore kind of the equities as to whether or not to mandate it, I think, will be different. But strictly from a legal standpoint, I think we're already at a point where you can do so much in terms of mandating the vaccine already. It's not going to make a difference to disability and reasonable accommodations requests, because they're still going to be in play at that time. And obviously all the other things we've talked about, it's going to be the same. But I do think that it will make it easier from a public relations standpoint to put a mandate in place if that's what someone wants to do.
And even further down the road, what about with the boosters?
Yeah, it's interesting because we got this question this week from a client about updating their vaccination policy to include the booster. And I think it's too new to know, because we don't know exactly. The federal government just said yesterday that they're going to start recommending the boosters at 8 months. They haven't officially done it yet, and it's not going to be available until September. But I think that it's going to be an interest. The short answer is we don't know. It's going to be interesting how it plays into people's vaccination policies, whether they're going to require people to get the booster after 8 months in their vaccination policies. At this point, I would say no, just because we don't know yet exactly how the science is going to play out. We don't know how strongly the CDC is going to be recommending the boosters. But at the end of the day, it's just too early to tell how those boosters play into the general approach to the vaccinations. All we really have is a pretty broad communication from the Biden administration saying that they're going to start recommending the boosters after September and making them available. And again, we're not necessarily dealing with the healthcare facilities. That might become more of an issue if you're working inside healthcare facilities, where they're going to be a little bit stricter about requiring boosters and requiring the vaccines as well. And I certainly hope that was helpful. I know there's a lot of information, and I'm happy to speak offline with anybody about any details of that.
And Josh, thank you. That is just terrific information. And thank you, everyone. All of you who joined us today who are UAC members, we thank you for your support and appreciate your membership. We try to bring you great value. If you're not currently a member of the Urban Ag Council, I hope that you will go to our website and consider joining, to helping support us as we support the industry. There are great testimonials from many of our members as to why they are our members, and we would appreciate you considering that.